The spotlight carved through the cigarette smoke like a blade that night in 1965, bathing the Sands Hotel stage in liquid gold. The Copa room hummed with the electric energy of a Las Vegas crowd that knew it was witnessing history. Diamonds caught the light from ringside tables. Ice clinked in crystal glasses. The scent of expensive perfume mingled with Cuban cigars as 3,000 people leaned forward in their velvet seats, waiting for the magic that only happened when these two voices collided. Frank Sinatra stood center stage, sharp as a switchblade in his midnight black tuxedo, that famous smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Beside him, Dean Martin looked effortless in the way that only he could manage. The drink in his hand caught the stage lights like liquid amber. His eyes held that trademark sleepy indifference, the carefully crafted mask of a man who seemed perpetually half bored, half buzzed, and completely untouchable. They were midway through a duet, the kind that would make grandchildren stop their conversations 50 years later. The orchestra swelled behind them, 40 professional musicians locked into a rhythm that felt inevitable as breathing. Dean's voice drifted over the melody, soft and smoky, making every word sound like a secret he'd almost rather not share. The audience hung on every note, every gesture, every piece of seemingly improvised banter between the two kings of American entertainment. But magic is a fragile thing. It lives in the space between trust and performance, in the unspoken agreements that hold friendships together under the crushing weight of fame. And on this particular night, with millions watching on television and the whole world believing in the myth they'd created, that trust was about to shatter. Frank made the joke during Dean's verse. Maybe it was the adrenaline of the crowd. Maybe it was ego. Maybe it was the kind of casual cruelty that powerful men mistake for charm. A theatrical wince. A comment about Dean's phrasing, his tone, his voice. The very instrument that had carried him from Steubenville steel mills to the summit of American entertainment. The audience laughed, because when Frank Sinatra makes a joke, you laugh. The band kept playing, because professionals know the show must go on. But Dean Martin stopped singing. The silence that followed lasted maybe 4 seconds, but those who were there swear it felt like an eternity. Dean's hand went up, not dramatically, not with anger, just a simple gesture that every musician on that stage understood immediately. The band stumbled to a halt, instruments dying mid-phrase like birds shot from the sky. 3,000 people held their breath. Frank's smirk faltered, revealing something raw and surprised underneath. What happened next would echo through Hollywood for decades, because the man the world thought of as the perpetual drunk, the lovable fool, the guy who was just happy to be there, was about to teach the most powerful entertainer on the planet something about dignity, respect, and the line you don't cross, even when you're Frank Sinatra. Dean Martin spent his life making the difficult look easy, but stories like this reveal the heavy cost of that cool. If you want to keep the memory of the true Rat Pack alive, consider supporting the channel by buying me a coffee using the link in the description. Your support helps us uncover these lost legends. Now, let's go back to that frozen moment on stage, when the music stopped and the mask finally slipped. They used to say Dean Martin was born in second place, but the truth was more complicated than that. Long before the tuxedos and the Sands marquee, before the slow smile that women memorized and men tried to imitate, there was just Dino Crocetti from Steubenville, Ohio, a boy who spoke broken English and broken Italian, who learned very early that if you stayed quiet and watched the room, you survived. Steel mills, card games, backroom smoke thick enough to chew. He grew up in places where men didn't talk about dreams. They talked about shifts and debts, about getting through the week. But that voice was already there, perfect and untouchable. Even as a kid, when he sang over the hum of factory whistles and the clatter of dishes in cheap clubs, people stopped. Not because he belted. Dean never belted. He slid into a melody, the way other men slid into a good chair after a long day. Effortless, like he was just humming to himself, and you happened to be close enough to overhear. What they couldn't see was the technical mastery hiding behind that casual delivery. Perfect pitch, the ability to match a trumpet's tone with just his voice. The rare gift of feeling when a band was speeding up just by the way the floor vibrated under his shoes. He possessed something that couldn't be taught or faked, but he wore it so lightly that people assumed it must be easy. That last part became his curse. When Jerry Lewis came along in 1946, the pattern became public and permanent. America fell head over heels for Jerry, the wild comic genius, the manic energy bouncing off walls. Dean was cast as the handsome straight man, the guy with the drink and the song who set up the punchline. For 10 years, they were untouchable. Lines around the block, radio, television, movies. They rewrote the rules of comedy. But if you read the old clippings, you see it in black and white. Jerry the visionary, Jerry the genius, Jerry the star. Dean, the good-looking crooner, who was lucky to be standing next to him. The night they broke up in 1956, people whispered that Dean's career was finished. Even their friends believed it. The quiet one never gets the applause when the lights go off. No one gave him credit for the timing, the rhythm, the way his calm presence made Jerry's chaos possible. They saw the mask, not the man. Inside, it stung. He didn't scream. He didn't write angry letters. He just walked away and let the world think what it wanted. But the scar stayed. Being treated as an accessory to someone else's greatness became a wound he carried lightly, like a well-tailored coat, there, but invisible to most. Then came Frank. Sinatra reached for Dean at a moment when both of them needed each other. Frank's career had already crashed and resurrected once. He recognized another survivor when he saw one. He brought Dean into the Rat Pack, wrapped an arm around him in public, called him his brother, and in a way, he saved him. Suddenly, Dean was on the biggest stages in the world, name lit up over the most glamorous rooms on earth. But salvation has its price. The Rat Pack was Frank's kingdom. Everybody knew it. The jokes, the timing, the entrances and exits, they orbited around him like planets around a sun. And Dean? Dean played the role the world had written for him, the lovable drunk, the easygoing sidekick, the man who seemed perfectly content to stand one step to the left of the spotlight. The irony was brutal. The one man in that group who could walk into a studio and nail a song in one take while Sinatra agonized over phrasing for hours, who possessed a natural musical gift that session musicians quietly worshipped. He was the one the public took least seriously. The slurred delivery, the glass in his hand, the lazy posture. People believed the act. They assumed the looseness came from liquor, not talent. Behind the curtain, the musicians knew the truth. Dean could correct a chord change with a raised eyebrow, feel the pulse of a 40-piece orchestra through his fingertips. But he wore his skill like he wore everything else, lightly, almost apologetically, as if drawing attention to it would be a kind of vulgarity. Standing next to Frank, it became both a refuge and a burden. Let Sinatra fight for dominance. Let Sinatra roar and command and conquer the crowd. Dean let him. It was easier to be the man who looked like he didn't care. Easier to hide the sting of being perpetually underestimated behind a joke and a refill. The persona protected him from criticism, from expectation, from the weight of having to prove himself over and over to people who'd already decided he was just lucky. But personas are prisons with invisible bars. And on that night in Las Vegas, with the lights hot and the house full, Dean Martin, professional second place, master of letting things slide, was about to discover that even the most patient man has a fault line. Even the coolest mask has a crack. Frank looked at Dean and saw the sidekick, the straight man, the guy who would take the insult and smile that lazy smile. He didn't realize that after 20 years of holding back, the shadow was finally ready to stand on its own. The Copa Room at the Sands was less a nightclub than a cathedral of American excess, breathing with the collective anticipation of 3,000 people who knew they were witnessing something unrepeatable. Senators sat beside mob bosses, movie stars next to oil tycoons, all jammed into red velvet booths, sharing the same smoke-thick air as the gods on stage. The heat from the lights was physical, a heavy blanket that made ice melt faster than you could drink it, while the electricity in the room felt almost dangerous, charged with the kind of energy that only exists when legends share a stage and anything might happen. They were deep into the second set, trading verses on a ballad that should have been standard, but became something else entirely when these two voices wrapped around it. The orchestra behind them moved like a single breathing organism, 40 professionals locked into a groove so tight you could build a house on it. Every trumpet player knew his cue by heart. Every violin understood the dynamic shifts. The drummer kept time with his eyes closed, feeling the rhythm in his bones. This was precision disguised as spontaneity, the result of thousands of hours making the unrehearsable look improvised. Dean's voice drifted over the melody like smoke finding its way through a room, unhurried and inevitable. He sang the way other men breathed, each phrase landing exactly where it needed to without appearing to try. The audience leaned forward without realizing it, drawn into that intimate space he created whenever he opened his mouth. For those few bars, the most famous room in Las Vegas belonged entirely to him, his voice carrying that technical mastery he wore so lightly that people mistook effortlessness for emptiness. The Rat Pack had built an empire on mockery dressed as affection, insults delivered with grins that said, "We can say this because we're brothers." Every show featured cutting remarks that walked the razor edge between friendship and cruelty, the dangerous energy that made every performance feel like eavesdropping on something private. The audience ate it up, came to see these titans needle each other with the kind of casual verbal violence that only true intimacy supposedly allows. But there were unspoken rules to the game, invisible lines drawn in the sand of their friendship. You could mock the persona, hit the public mask each man wore like armor. What you didn't touch was the craft itself, the thing he'd spent his life building when no one was watching. That was sacred ground, even among brothers who made their living breaking taboos. Frank either forgot the rule or thought it didn't apply to him. He was riding the wave of the crowd's energy, feeling that godlike rush that came from owning a room this completely, prowling the stage with his mic cord whipped around his wrist. When Dean reached for a particular note, something in Frank's performer brain saw an opportunity, a chance to get a laugh, to remind everyone who conducted this orchestra. He made a face, theatrical and exaggerated, a wince of mock pain. Then came the words, cutting through Dean's verse like a knife through silk. Something about the phrasing, the tone, a joke about Dean's voice that landed in the space between affection and contempt. The audience laughed because they were supposed to laugh. When Frank Sinatra makes a joke, you don't question whether it's funny. The band kept playing because professionals don't stop for anything. The brass section swelling for the next chorus, 40 instruments maintaining the illusion of seamless entertainment at all costs. But on stage, the temperature dropped 20 degrees. Dean didn't smile. He didn't offer the self-deprecating shrug that usually followed these moments. Instead, he went very still, a stillness that was louder than the band. His eyes, usually half-lidded and warm, sharpened. In that fraction of a second, Dean Martin did the math. He weighed the friendship, the history, the millions of dollars on the table. He thought about every time he'd played the fool so Frank could be the genius. Every time he'd step back so Frank could step forward. And quietly, without any drama, he decided that the tab was finally full. His hand came up slowly, almost gently, not dramatically, not with anger or theatrical flair. Just a simple raising of his palm that every musician on that stage understood in their gut. The trumpet player's note died mid-breath. The piano keys went silent under frozen fingers. 40 instruments stumbled into silence like dominoes falling in slow motion, each musician suddenly aware they were witnessing something that wasn't in any script. The quiet that followed had weight and texture, pressing against every chest in the room, demanding attention. 3,000 people held their breath collectively, the kind of silence that only happens when an audience realizes the performance has stopped being performance. Frank's smirk faltered, uncertainty looking foreign on his face as his eyes searched Dean's, looking for the familiar signal that this was part of the bit. But in the eyes of the man he thought he knew better than anyone, Frank saw something he wasn't prepared for. He saw a stranger. The microphone was still live, every breath audible, television cameras still rolling, capturing this moment for millions watching at home. The whole world was waiting to see what happened when the easygoing drunk, the man who never made waves, decided to stop the music and speak his truth. For a heartbeat, Dean just looked at him. The silence wasn't empty. It was crowded with 20 years of history, with Steubenville steel mills and Hoboken dreams, with broken contracts and mended friendships. The Copa room held its breath. 3,000 people suddenly aware they were witnessing something that wasn't in any script. Ice shifted in glasses at ringside tables. Cigarettes burned down to filters in forgotten hands. The 40-piece orchestra sat frozen, instruments lowered, caught between professional instinct and human fascination. Frank tried a half smile, that familiar Sinatra charm flickering to life, waiting for the usual out. The lazy grin, the throwaway line, the moment Dean would dissolve the tension and make it all a gag again. But Dean's face didn't move. The mask that had survived a lifetime of insults and assumptions finally slipped, and underneath there was no rage, no drunken fog, only a clarity that was almost painful to witness. He lifted the microphone slowly, not milking the moment, not playing for effect. When his voice came, it was soft, conversational, but the quiet made every syllable ring like a bell in the hushed room. "Frank," he said, and the way he said the name told everyone this wasn't part of any act. "Don't ever do that again." The words hung in the air, simple and absolute. No anger, no theatrics, just a line drawn in the sand, with the quiet authority of a man who'd finally decided where he stood. He didn't attack Frank's character or throw an insult back. Instead, he spoke about respect, not the kind you demand with volume, but the kind you earn through craft. "We're lucky to be here," Dean continued, his gaze never leaving Frank's face. "We're lucky people pay to hear us sing. Don't make it small." He talked about the work, about the years it takes to make something look effortless, about the musicians behind them who'd spent lifetimes perfecting their instruments. His voice carried that same technical mastery he'd always hidden behind casualness, but now it served a different purpose. He was teaching, not performing, drawing attention to the invisible architecture that held their world together, the craft that deserved better than becoming someone's punchline. The audience gasped, a collective intake of breath that rippled through the room like a wave. They'd come expecting legends playing at being human. Instead, they were watching humans struggle to remain legendary. The band members sat transfixed, suddenly visible as more than hired help, feeling seen and defended by someone who didn't have to defend them. Frank's face went through a journey in those 30 seconds. First came the flash of wounded pride, the instinctive bristle of a man who wasn't used to being corrected, especially not in public. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowed. For a heartbeat, it looked like he might fire back, might turn this into the kind of legendary blow-up that would define both their legacies. But then, something shifted. Maybe it was the way the room had gone completely still, the audience holding its breath not in anticipation of entertainment, but in recognition of something real. Maybe it was seeing the faces of the orchestra, frozen with their instruments, suddenly human rather than background. Or maybe Frank Sinatra, for all his ego and fire, simply recognized the sound of truth when he heard it. The smirk died completely. What replaced it was harder to read. Surprise, certainly. Embarrassment, possibly. But underneath, something that looked almost like respect. The uncomfortable recognition that the man he'd been standing next to all these years had depths he'd never bothered to measure. Dean let the silence breathe, giving Frank space to respond, giving the words room to land. He wasn't trying to humiliate. That would have been easy, would have been the Sinatra playbook. Instead, he was doing something harder. He was establishing a boundary, saying without saying that friendship has limits, and tonight they'd found one. The tension stretched like a wire pulled to its breaking point. Frank had to respond. The whole world was watching, literally. Television cameras still rolling, capturing every micro-expression. Whatever he said next would either save the friendship or destroy it, would either prove he was the man he claimed to be, or reveal something smaller underneath the legend. The silence stretched so tight you could almost hear it humming, a living thing that pressed against every chest in the Copa room. Frank Sinatra stood there, the man who could command any room with a raised eyebrow, suddenly looking like he'd wandered onto the wrong stage entirely. The lights that usually crowned him now felt like an interrogation, too bright, too honest. For a career built on dominance, on being the chairman of the board who never apologized to anyone, this was uncharted territory. He looked at Dean, really looked at him, past the drink and the sleepy-eyed persona that had fooled everyone for so long. In that moment, Frank saw the friend who had just drawn a line in the sand with quiet, devastating precision. You could almost see the machinery of pride grinding in his chest, the instinct to crack another joke, to yank the moment back into safe, familiar territory where he controlled the script. But the room wouldn't let him. Those 3,000 people weren't hungry for another laugh anymore. They were waiting to see if the king could bow without breaking. When Frank finally brought the microphone to his lips, his voice was different, stripped of the bulletproof swagger that usually rode on every syllable, softer, unguarded, in a way that stages rarely allow. "You're right, pal," he said, and the word pal carried more weight than it ever had in 1,000 rehearsed routines. No wink, no rimshot, just an admission laid bare in front of strangers. I was out of line. I'm sorry. It wasn't poetry, but it didn't need to be. What made it powerful was everything Frank Sinatra chose not to do in that moment. He didn't blame the booze or deflect with charm. He didn't pivot into a story or try to paint his insult as misunderstood affection. He simply stood in the harshest light a performer could stand in and owned his mistake. The apology wasn't scripted, wasn't calculated for maximum effect. It was clumsy in the way real contrition always is, lacking the polish of his usual stage patter. A collective exhale swept through the Copa room, a physical release of tension that rippled from the front tables all the way to the back wall. The audience didn't know whether to applaud or stay silent. A few hands started to come together uncertainly, but most people just sat there, processing what they'd witnessed. This wasn't the entertainment they'd paid for. It was better and more uncomfortable, the kind of human moment that usually happens behind closed doors. Dean's face softened almost imperceptibly. Not a smile exactly, but a slight relaxation around his eyes that suggested acceptance. He nodded once, a small gesture that carried enormous weight, then turned back to the orchestra with a different energy entirely. "From the top, boys," he said, his easy drawl returning, but now it felt earned rather than automatic. The band came alive like a held breath finally released, instruments finding their places in the arrangement, rebuilding the song from silence. But everything sounded different now. The same notes, the same chord progressions, but transformed by what had just passed between these two men. When their voices joined again, there was an equality in the blend that hadn't existed before. Not leader and sidekick anymore, but two professionals respecting each other's craft. Two friends who'd just survived a moment that could have destroyed them. Backstage, away from the cameras and chandeliers, the real conversation happened in the quiet spaces between lighting cues. No shouting, no smashed glasses, no dramatic reconciliation. That wasn't their way. Instead, there was Frank going to Dean first, which in their unspoken hierarchy meant everything. A handshake that lasted a beat too long, a silence that said more than any monologue could, and a mutual understanding carved out of uncomfortable honesty. 50 years later, a trumpet player from that orchestra would tell his grandson about it. pointing to a fading photograph tucked into an old music case. "That's the night I saw Sinatra say he was wrong," he'd whisper. And that's the night I realized Martin wasn't just the funny drunk. He was the spine. The next morning's newspapers mostly missed the point, but the people who'd worked the stage knew better. That night became a quiet landmark, a moment when power didn't just apologize, it listened. And for Dean, it became proof that once you've heard your own truth ring out and watched the room stay standing, it's impossible to go back to pretending you're just lucky to be there. The incident slipped into legend the way a stone disappears beneath the surface of a lake, gone from sight, but sending ripples outward in every direction. Word spread through the invisible network of musicians, stagehands, and producers who'd been in the room that night or heard about it from someone who was. The story traveled through recording studios and green rooms, getting polished with each retelling but never losing its essential truth. Dean Martin, the perpetual sidekick, had stopped Frank Sinatra mid-song and emerged with something more valuable than victory. He'd claimed his dignity without destroying the friendship. For Dean, the shift was subtle but profound. The roles he was offered changed texture, directors suddenly noticing the actor underneath the charming drunk persona. Scripts arrived that required quiet authority rather than just comedic timing. His recording sessions took on a different quality, too. Producers giving him creative control they'd never offered before, trusting his instincts about arrangements and phrasing in ways that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. The persona remained. He was too smart to abandon what worked, but now it felt like a choice rather than a cage. In interviews years later, Dean would reference that night with characteristic understatement, never making it bigger than it needed to be. "Frank and I had a moment," he'd say, waving his cigarette dismissively. "We worked it out." But people who knew him well caught something in his eyes when he talked about it, a quiet satisfaction that suggested the memory meant more than he'd ever admit. It was proof that standing your ground didn't require volume or violence, that dignity could be claimed with a raised hand and a few honest words. Other performers took notice, especially those who'd spent careers swallowing insults to keep powerful people happy. A lounge singer in Reno told a friend he'd stopped laughing off headliners' cruel jokes after hearing about the Sands incident. "If Martin could stop the band on Sinatra," he said, "I could at least tell a guy not to spit on my song." Backup singers who'd been mocked for missing notes started speaking up. Session musicians began demanding credit on albums. The ripple effect was impossible to measure precisely, but it was real. Dean had demonstrated that you could challenge the king without losing your crown. Frank changed too, though he'd never frame it that way. A string arranger remembered Sinatra checking in with him on a new chart, saying, "You like it this way?" A small question that would have been unthinkable before. The man who had once ruled by sheer force of will began, occasionally, to ask instead of assume. Their friendship didn't just survive the confrontation, it deepened, evolving from a partnership of convenience into a bond forged in tested honesty. Dean's children would later describe how their father carried himself differently after that period, a man who discovered he could defend what mattered without becoming someone he wasn't. The pattern revealed itself when you looked closely at his later years, the anonymous donations to struggling musicians, the quiet phone calls to producers on behalf of blacklisted performers, the way he'd stop rehearsals if someone was being treated poorly. He'd found his method, his signature approach to injustice, not loud, not public, but absolutely unyielding. Hollywood kept misunderstanding him, kept seeing the surface and missing the architecture underneath. But the people who mattered knew. The musicians, the crew members, the performers who'd watched him draw that line in the sand, they understood what Dean Martin actually was. Not just the king of cool, but something rarer. A man who'd figured out that real power isn't about dominating a room. But there's one more layer to this story, one final revelation that shows why Dean Martin was the most misunderstood man in Hollywood. The night Dean stopped the band wasn't an anomaly. It was the Rosetta Stone for understanding everything that came before and after. That frozen moment on the sand stage revealed a pattern that had been running quietly beneath the surface of his entire life, invisible to everyone who mistook his stillness for indifference. While the world watched him stumble through sketches with a drink in his hand, Dean was writing checks to strangers whose names he'd never mention. While critics dismissed him as Jerry's straight man or Frank's sidekick, he was rescuing lives with phone calls made from empty dressing rooms after everyone else had gone home. There was the studio musician who lost his house in a fire. Dean heard about it third hand, never met the man, but an envelope arrived with enough cash to rebuild and no return address. A backup singer struggling with medical bills found her debt mysteriously paid off after Dean overheard a conversation in a hallway. When a blacklisted screenwriter couldn't get work, Dean hired him under a pseudonym, paying full rate for scripts he didn't even need. The washed-up comic who suddenly got a spot on Dean's variety show after a phone call no one heard. The grip working sick because he couldn't afford to miss a paycheck. Finding an envelope in his locker with a week's wages and a note that said, "Get well." He operated in the margins, in the spaces between spotlights, guided by a philosophy that was simple but radical in a town built on publicity. Dean believed that if you had to announce your goodness, it wasn't goodness anymore, it was marketing. He'd grown up watching Steubenville neighbors help each other without fanfare, without expecting medals or newspaper coverage. You saw someone struggling, you helped if you could, then you went about your business. The idea of turning compassion into a photo opportunity felt obscene to him, a corruption of something that should remain sacred. But the cost of that privacy was steep. The persona he'd built to protect himself became so convincing that people believed it completely, including those closest to him. His own children sometimes struggled to reach the man behind the mask, finding warmth but also distance, affection filtered through layers of protective performance. Friends who wanted more of him found only the affable surface. The tragedy of making everything look easy is that people eventually stop believing you're working at all. He spent his life convincing the world he didn't care, and they believed him so completely they almost missed his genius entirely. In his final years, when Frank Sinatra fought against the dying of the light, raging against irrelevance until his final breath, Dean chose a different path. He simply stepped back, fading into the silence he had always craved, content to let the world forget him if it meant finding peace. He chose solitude over spectacle, trading the stage for quiet restaurants where he could eat pasta and watch the world go by, finally free from the need to perform for anyone. But looking back at that frozen moment in 1965 recontextualizes everything. When Dean Martin raised his hand and stopped the band, he wasn't just defending his voice. He was defending every artist who ever made the difficult look easy, every person who ever stood quietly in second place while carrying first-place talent. In 3 seconds of silence, he taught the world that being cool isn't about not caring. It's about caring so much that you refuse to let anyone, not even Frank Sinatra, diminish what matters. That night, the king of cool became something rarer and more valuable, a man who chose character over celebrity, dignity over destruction, truth over performance. That's not just legend, that's immortality.